Pack your bags before we get back. That was the text my son sent me while I was standing beside my husband's casket at the funeral home. I read the message 3 times before the meaning finally settled into my chest like cold iron. Around me, people were hugging quietly, dabbing tears from their eyes, speaking in hushed voices about what a good man Harold Whitmore had been. Someone touched my shoulder and said they were sorry for my loss, but I barely heard them. My eyes stayed fixed on the glowing screen in my trembling hand. Pack your bags before we get back. No hello. No mom. No kindness. Just an order. As if I were some unwanted guest staying too long in a hotel room instead of the woman who had spent 42 years building that home beside her husband. I slowly locked my phone and slipped it into my purse. Then I straightened my back, folded my hands in front of me, and looked at Harold one last time before the funeral director closed the casket. My husband always hated public scenes. Dignity costs nothing, he used to tell me whenever life became difficult. So I stood there quietly while my entire world cracked open beneath my feet. The drive back from the cemetery felt longer than usual. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while my sister Diane drove beside me in silence. She offered to stay the night, but I told her I'd be fine. I wasn't fine, of course. Nothing about me was fine. My husband had been gone for 6 days. The funeral flowers still filled the back seat with the heavy scent of lilies, and now I had a son telling me to leave my own house before he returned from the burial reception with his wife. My own son, Jason Whitmore. The little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms because he was afraid of lightning. The little boy Harold coached through little league games every summer until his knees started giving him trouble. Somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared. By the time we pulled into my driveway, dusk had settled over the neighborhood. The porch light was already on. Brittany always hated coming home to a dark house. Even before she married Jason, she had opinions about everything. The curtains, the paint colors, the landscaping. Harold used to laugh quietly and whisper to me that Brittany acted like she was running for mayor of the subdivision. At the time, I thought it was harmless. Looking back now, I realized she had been rearranging pieces on the board for years. Diane squeezed my hand before leaving. "Call me if you need anything," she said softly. I nodded and forced a small smile. Then I walked toward the front door carrying the casserole dishes people had sent home after the funeral luncheon. My heels clicked against the walkway. The sound echoed strangely in the quiet evening air. When I stepped inside, I stopped so suddenly one of the casserole dishes nearly slipped from my hands. There were white stickers attached to several pieces of furniture in the living room. Small rectangular labels. Moving sale. I stared at them without breathing. One on Harold's leather recliner. One on the antique side table we bought during our 10th anniversary trip to Vermont. Another on the china cabinet my mother left me before she died. My heart began pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Slowly, I set the dishes down on the kitchen counter and walked deeper into the house. More stickers. Lamps. Shelves. Framed artwork. Someone had even placed a blue strip of painter's tape across the grandfather clock Harold spent 2 years restoring in our garage. I heard voices coming from the dining room. Brittany's voice floated through first. Cheerful. Relaxed. Natural lighting is definitely the selling point, she said. Another voice answered her. A man's voice I didn't recognize. I stepped into the doorway and saw Brittany standing beside a tall man in a gray blazer holding an iPad. A realtor. He turned toward me with a professional smile that faded the second he noticed my black funeral dress. Brittany's expression tightened for just a second before the smile returned to her face. "Oh," she said lightly, "you're home already." Home already. As if I had just come back from grocery shopping instead of burying my husband. The realtor looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, extending his hand. "I'm Ellen Pierce with Fairview Realty." I looked at his hand but didn't take it. My eyes moved slowly back to Brittany. She was wearing cream-colored cashmere and gold earrings shaped like tiny leaves. Not a trace of black anywhere. Not even for the funeral luncheon earlier that afternoon. "What is this?" I asked quietly. Brittany crossed her arms. "Jason thought it would be smart to start preparing early," she said. "The market's really competitive right now." I stared at her. For a moment, I honestly wondered if I had heard her correctly. Preparing what? Her tone sharpened slightly, impatience slipping through the polished surface. The house, Eleanor. It doesn't make sense for one person to stay in a place this large anymore. One person. That was all I was now. Not Harold's wife. Not Jason's mother. Just one person taking up too much space. The realtor shifted awkwardly near the dining table. Perhaps this isn't the best time, he muttered. Brittany ignored him completely. Jason and I talked about this months ago, she continued. Honestly, it's better to handle everything quickly instead of dragging it out emotionally. Emotionally? I looked around the room slowly. Harold's favorite reading chair sat near the window. His coffee mug was still beside the sink because I couldn't bring myself to wash it yet. The funeral flowers hadn't even wilted. And already they were measuring walls and tagging furniture like scavengers walking through an estate sale. I suddenly noticed something else. The framed family portrait that usually hung above the fireplace was missing. Where's the picture? I asked. Brittany glanced over casually. Oh, I moved it upstairs. The wall looked cleaner without it. Cleaner without it. Without us. Without 42 years of marriage staring back from the mantel. I felt something inside me grow very still then. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something sharper. The kind of silence that comes before a winter storm. Alan cleared his throat nervously. I should probably come back another time. Brittany sighed dramatically. Fine. He gathered his tablet quickly and hurried toward the front door. Before leaving, he glanced back at me with visible embarrassment. The second the door closed, the house became painfully quiet. Brittany walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of sparkling water like nothing unusual had happened. Jason should be back soon, she said. We figured it would be easier if your things were mostly packed before the weekend. I looked at her carefully. My things? Well, she said with a shrug, you won't need most of the furniture where you're going. I didn't ask where she thought I was going. Somehow I already knew she had every detail planned out. Probably before Harold was even buried. I slowly removed my coat and draped it over the chair near the doorway. My movements felt calm. Too calm. Brittany watched me closely, almost disappointed that I wasn't crying or shouting. Harold used to say people reveal themselves most clearly when they think they've already won. Standing there in my kitchen, I realized Brittany believed exactly that. And somewhere along the way, my son had started believing it too. Jason came home an hour later carrying 2 foil containers from the funeral luncheon while Brittany sat at the kitchen island scrolling through furniture listings on her phone, as if this were any ordinary evening. The moment he stepped through the door, I noticed he avoided looking directly at me. That hurt more than the text message itself. Cruelty from strangers is one thing. But there is something unbearable about watching your own child choose cowardice instead of compassion. Hey, Mom, he said quietly, setting the food containers on the counter. His voice sounded tired, almost rehearsed. I nodded once. Jason. Brittany did not look up from her phone. The realtor thinks we could list by next Friday if we repaint the downstairs, she said casually. Jason shifted uncomfortably. Maybe not tonight, Britt. There is never a good night for these conversations, she replied. Then she finally looked at me with that same polished smile she wore around church friends and neighbors. We are only trying to help you, Eleanor. Help me. I remembered when Jason was 8 years old and came home crying because another boy pushed him off the monkey bars at school. Harold sat beside him at the kitchen table for nearly an hour explaining that real strength came from protecting people, not hurting them. Jason listened carefully back then. He had such a soft heart as a child. He used to rescue stray cats from alleys and beg us to keep them. One winter, he spent 3 weeks building a wooden bird feeder in Harold's garage because he was worried the birds would get cold during a snowstorm. Looking at him now standing beside Brittany with his shoulders tense and his eyes fixed on the floor, I wondered exactly when kindness stopped mattering to him. Did you move the furniture stickers yourselves? I asked calmly. Jason rubbed the back of his neck. Brittany was just organizing ideas. The realtor did most of it, Brittany added quickly. Honestly, Eleanor, you are focusing on the wrong thing. This house is almost 4,000 square feet. It is too much for one person your age. My age. Funny how age only becomes important when people want something from you. Harold never made me feel old. 2 months before he passed, He still reached for my hand every morning when we walked down the driveway to get the newspaper. Even during chemotherapy, he smiled whenever he saw me enter the room. "There she is," he would say softly to every nurse who walked by. As if I were still the prettiest woman in Illinois instead of a gray-haired grandmother with arthritis in both knees. I turned toward the sink and slowly filled a glass with water. My hands were steady now. The shock had settled into something heavier, something clearer. "When were you planning to tell me?" I asked. Jason finally looked at me then. His eyes were bloodshot from the funeral, but there was frustration there too. "Mom, we have talked about this before." I stared at him. "No, Jason. Brittany talked." You stood behind her and nodded. His jaw tightened. Brittany sighed dramatically. "See? This is exactly what I was afraid of. You are making us into villains for trying to make practical decisions." Practical. That word again. Everything cold-hearted suddenly becomes practical when people want to avoid guilt. Jason pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down heavily. "Mom, listen. We are not throwing you out." I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because funeral flowers still sat on the dining room table while my belongings were already being sorted like leftovers after a yard sale. "Then why did you tell me to pack my bags before you got home?" The room went silent. Brittany looked toward Jason immediately. He swallowed hard. "I did not mean it like that." "Then how did you mean it?" He looked exhausted suddenly. "Older than 42. We just thought it would be easier if things moved quickly." "Easier for who?" I did not say the words aloud because I already knew the answer. Brittany walked toward the refrigerator and opened it. "Honestly, dragging this out would only make the grieving process worse," she said while examining leftovers from the funeral meal. "Fresh starts are healthier." Fresh starts. Harold had not even been buried 24 hours. I looked around the kitchen slowly. The yellow ceramic bowl near the stove still held the wrapped peppermint candies Harold liked after dinner. His reading glasses sat folded beside yesterday's newspaper. There was a faint coffee stain near the toaster because he always overfilled his mug during breakfast. Everywhere I looked, traces of him remained. This was not just a house. It was 42 years of ordinary life stitched into walls and furniture and tiny routines nobody else noticed. I remembered the night we first moved in. Jason was only 5 years old. Harold carried him upstairs asleep in his arms while I unpacked dishes in the kitchen. We sat on the floor eating cold takeout hamburgers because we had not found the pots yet. Harold smiled at me and said, "Someday this place is going to hold our whole life." He was right. And now our whole life had become an inconvenience. Brittany closed the refrigerator door sharply. "The upstairs guest room would actually work perfectly as a nursery," she said casually. I blinked. "Nursery?" Jason hesitated before answering. "We were waiting for the right moment to tell you." Brittany smiled proudly and rested a hand over her stomach. "I am 12 weeks pregnant." For a moment I simply stared at her. A grandchild. Under different circumstances, that news would have filled the house with joy. Harold would have cried. He always became emotional about babies. The last time Brittany announced a pregnancy scare 3 years ago, Harold spent an entire weekend building a wooden rocking horse before they discovered it was a false alarm. I still remembered how disappointed he looked carrying the unfinished horse back into the garage. "Congratulations," I said quietly. Brittany relaxed slightly, almost relieved by my calm reaction. "Thank you," she said. "That is why we need more space now." There it was. The real reason. Not concern for my well-being. Not grief. Space. Jason leaned forward at the table. "Mom, we are trying to build a future here." I looked at him carefully. "And where exactly do I fit into that future?" Neither of them answered immediately. The silence stretched long enough to say everything for them. Finally Brittany spoke. "There are some beautiful senior communities outside Naperville," she said gently, as if discussing vacation resorts instead of removing someone from their home. "They have fitness centers and social clubs and transportation services." I looked at her for several seconds before speaking. "You already toured them, did you not?" Her expression froze for half a second. That was all the answer I needed. Jason looked uncomfortable again. Brittany was only researching options. Researching options. Before Harold even died. A strange calm settled over me then. The kind that comes when pain becomes too large to fully process all at once. I walked slowly toward the staircase. I am tired, I said quietly. Jason stood halfway from his chair. Mom. I paused at the bottom step but did not turn around. Your father once told me a person shows their true character during funerals, I said softly. I finally understand what he meant. Then I walked upstairs to the bedroom Harold and I shared for over 4 decades. But the second I opened the door, I stopped breathing. Half my closet was already empty. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring at the empty space inside my closet. The hanger swayed slightly as if someone had rushed while packing. Half my dresses were gone. My winter coats too. Even the shoebox where I kept old birthday cards from Harold had disappeared from the top shelf. The room felt wrong somehow. Disturbed. Violated in a quiet, careful way that almost hurt more than if someone had screamed in my face. Slowly, I walked farther inside the bedroom. Harold's side of the closet remained untouched. His flannel shirt still hung neatly in place beside the navy blazer he wore every Christmas Eve. His slippers sat beside the bed exactly where he left them the night before his final hospital stay. But my side looked like someone had already begun erasing me from the house. I opened the dresser drawers one by one. Empty spaces everywhere. My favorite blue sweater was gone. Several framed photographs were missing too. I pressed my hand against the dresser to steady myself. Downstairs, I could hear Brittany laughing softly at something on television while dishes clinked in the kitchen sink. The normalcy of it made my chest ache. Harold had not even been gone a week. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed and looked around the room we had shared for more than 4 decades. This room had once held our entire marriage. The wallpaper Harold insisted on hanging himself one summer even though neither of us knew what we were doing. The oak bed frame he built in the garage after watching instructional videos for nearly 2 months. The tiny water stain near the ceiling from the storm back in 1998, when we spent an entire night placing buckets around the room while laughing so hard we barely slept. Every inch of this space held memories stitched into it like threads in old fabric. And downstairs, my son and his wife were discussing paint samples. My eyes drifted toward Harold's nightstand. His Bible still rested beside the lamp along with his reading glasses and the small leather notebook he carried everywhere during the last year of his illness. I reached for the notebook carefully. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Harold always wrote things down. Grocery lists, doctor appointments, notes about weather forecasts, little reminders to himself. Most pages were filled with ordinary things. Pick up birdseed, call pharmacy, pay electric bill. But near the back, I found something that made my stomach tighten. Several pages had names written repeatedly. Jason, Brittany, realtor, lawyer. Beside Brittany's name, Harold had written one sentence in shaky handwriting. She thinks I do not notice. I stared at those words for a very long time. Harold noticed everything. Even toward the end, when chemotherapy left him exhausted and pale, he still paid attention to the smallest changes around him. I remembered one evening about 3 months before he passed. We were sitting on the back porch watching the sun go down while Jason and Brittany visited inside with takeout containers. Through the kitchen window, I could see Brittany opening cabinets and drawers while pretending to help clean up dinner. Harold watched quietly for a moment before leaning closer to me. "That girl studies this house like she is memorizing it," he whispered. At the time, I told him he was imagining things because stress from the illness was making him suspicious. I regretted those words now. There had been other moments too. Small moments I ignored because I wanted peace more than truth. Brittany asking detailed questions about property taxes during Thanksgiving dinner. Jason casually mentioning how much homes in our neighborhood were selling for. Brittany suggesting we convert the downstairs office into a nursery someday, even though she was not pregnant then. Piece by piece, the memories began fitting together differently in my mind. Like puzzle pieces finally locking into place after years of confusion. I suddenly heard footsteps on the staircase. The bedroom door opened slightly and Jason stepped inside. He looked exhausted. His black funeral tie hung loose around his neck and his shoulders sagged heavily. For just a second he looked like my little boy again. Lost. Uncertain. "Mom," he said softly. I closed Harold's notebook carefully and placed it back on the nightstand. "Did Brittany pack my things?" He hesitated too long before answering. We both helped. Helped. Such a gentle word for something so cruel. I looked at him steadily. While I was at the funeral home? He rubbed his face tiredly. We thought it would make things easier. For who? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked farther into the room and glanced around awkwardly. You cannot stay here alone forever, he said finally. This house is too much. I almost smiled sadly at how familiar the phrase sounded now. Too much house. Too much grief. Too much inconvenience. Your father and I bought this house when you were 5 years old, I said quietly. Do you remember that? Jason sighed softly. Mom, do you remember helping Harold plant the maple tree out front? His jaw tightened. Please do not do this. But I kept going because suddenly I needed him to hear it. You cried because the shovel was too heavy and your father let you pour the first bucket of water on the roots. You were so proud afterward that you told every neighbor on the street you planted the tree yourself. Jason looked away toward the window. Silence filled the room between us. People change, he muttered finally. No, I said softly. They reveal themselves. He turned back toward me then, frustration flashing across his face. That is not fair. Is it fair to clear out your mother's closet before she finishes grieving her husband? The words landed harder than I intended. Jason's expression shifted immediately from anger to guilt. He sat heavily in the chair near Harold's desk and stared at the floor. You think this is easy for me? He asked quietly. Brittany is pregnant. We need stability right now. Stability. Another carefully chosen word. I studied my son's face. He looked older than his years suddenly. Worn down. Pulled in opposite directions for so long that he no longer recognized himself. Your father was dying, I said carefully. And somehow you were already planning renovations. He flinched slightly. That told me enough. Downstairs, Brittany called his name sharply. Jason, did you find the paperwork? His eyes widened briefly before he stood too quickly. I have to go help her. Paperwork. I watched him move toward the door. What paperwork? He froze for half a second without turning around. Nothing important. Then he walked out. I sat motionless after he left, listening to their muffled voices downstairs. Something inside me had started changing. The grief was still there, heavy and suffocating, but underneath it now lived something colder. Awareness. I looked once more around the bedroom before slowly kneeling beside Harold's side of the bed. My knees ached against the hardwood floor as I reached underneath toward the back corner where Harold used to hide Christmas gifts every year. My fingers brushed against something metallic. A small brass key taped beneath the frame. I stared at it in silence while my heartbeat slowly quickened. Harold had left me something. I sat on the floor for a long moment staring at the small brass key resting in my palm. It looked ordinary, worn around the edges, slightly tarnished with age. But Harold had taped it beneath the bed frame carefully, deliberately, as if he knew I would eventually search for it. My heart beat harder with every passing second. Downstairs, I could still hear Brittany moving around the kitchen cabinets while Jason spoke softly near the front hallway. Their voices blended together in low murmurs that sounded strangely distant now. For the first time since Harold died, I felt something besides grief beginning to rise inside me. Curiosity. I closed my fingers around the key and slowly stood up. My knees protested immediately. Harold used to tease me about those knees every winter. You predict snow better than the Weather Channel, he would joke whenever storms rolled in and my joints started aching. I swallowed hard at the memory and walked toward Harold's old desk near the bedroom window. Most people thought the large oak desk was decorative because Harold retired years ago. But every evening after dinner, he still sat there balancing checkbooks, reading local news, or organizing documents into neat little folders nobody else understood except him. The bottom drawer remained locked. I had not noticed before because Harold almost never locked anything from me. Slowly, I slid the brass key into the drawer lock. Fit perfectly. The click sounded unnaturally loud in the silent bedroom. I opened the drawer carefully. Inside sat a thick manila envelope, a leather binder, and another smaller envelope with my name written across the front in Harold's uneven handwriting. Eleanor. My throat tightened instantly. I picked up the letter first. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I unfolded it. Darling, if you are reading this, it means I was right to worry. I had to stop reading for a moment because tears blurred the words. Harold's handwriting looked shakier than usual, probably written during one of the final months when the treatments left him weak. I pressed my fingers against my mouth before continuing. I know you will try to see the best in Jason because that is who you are. But I need you to listen to me carefully this time. Things have changed. I felt cold all over. Outside the bedroom window, rain continued falling softly across the dark backyard, while thunder rumbled far in the distance. The house suddenly felt heavier somehow, filled with things unsaid for too long. Harold's letter continued. Brittany started asking questions about the property last year. First I ignored it. Then Jason began asking too. About the deed. About taxes. About how quickly homes in our neighborhood were selling. They thought I did not notice. But I noticed everything. My chest tightened painfully. I remembered those conversations now. Little comments during dinner. Casual questions during holidays. At the time I convinced myself they were harmless because accepting the truth felt too ugly. Harold never ignored ugly truths. That was always the difference between us. I kept reading. 3 months ago, I overheard Brittany speaking with someone on the phone in the kitchen while you were visiting Diane. She said, "Once the house is ours, we can finally start living properly." I never told you because I did not want to burden you while I was sick. But I also could not leave you unprotected. I sat slowly in Harold's desk chair, gripping the letter tightly. The room blurred again as memories replayed themselves differently now. Brittany insisting on hosting family dinners at our house instead of hers. Jason offering to help Harold review financial paperwork after chemotherapy appointments. Brittany taking photographs of different rooms while pretending she wanted decorating advice. Every moment suddenly carried a second meaning. I looked toward the leather binder next. Inside were neatly organized copies of bank records, property documents, and legal papers. Harold had highlighted several sections carefully in yellow marker. One page immediately caught my attention. A private listing agreement draft from Fairview Realty dated nearly 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks. Harold was still alive 6 weeks ago. My stomach turned. Attached behind it sat handwritten notes in Harold's careful script. Jason thinks I am too weak to notice changes to the paperwork. Brittany contacted assisted living facilities before discussing anything with Eleanor. Do not trust verbal promises. I closed my eyes briefly. Assisted living facilities. They had already planned where to send me before Harold was even gone. The realization settled heavily into my chest. Not impulsive cruelty. Not grief-clouding judgment. Planning. Deliberate planning. I suddenly remembered a strange conversation from late spring. Harold had just returned from a hospital appointment, exhausted from treatment, when Jason stopped by unexpectedly. I was making soup in the kitchen while they spoke quietly in the den. At one point, voices rose sharply enough that I paused near the doorway. "It is just practical," Jason had said. Harold's reply came low and firm. "Not while your mother is alive." The moment they noticed me nearby, the conversation stopped. Later, when I asked Harold what they were discussing, he only smiled tiredly and said, "Nothing worth ruining dinner over." I understood now. My eyes drifted back toward the smaller envelope inside the drawer. Beneath my name, Harold had written another sentence. "Only open if they try to force you out." My hand shook harder opening that envelope. Inside was a folded legal document, bearing the letterhead of Donovan Pierce and Associates. Harold's attorney. I scanned the pages slowly at first, then faster as my heartbeat accelerated. The house had been transferred into an irrevocable trust nearly 2 months earlier. Sole beneficiary Eleanor Whitmore. Additional clause. Any immediate family member attempting coercion, forced sale, or housing displacement would automatically lose inheritance privileges connected to Harold's remaining financial assets. I stared at the page in complete silence. Harold knew. Not suspected. Knew. Every strange look. Every whispered conversation. Every calculated suggestion about downsizing. He had seen all of it while fighting for his life at the same time. Tears slid quietly down my face then, but they felt different now. Less helpless. More complicated. Harold had spent his final months protecting me while I kept insisting everything was fine. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside the bedroom. Instantly, I closed the binder and slid the documents back into the drawer except for Harold's letter, which I folded carefully into my sweater pocket. A second later, Brittany appeared in the doorway holding a cardboard box. "I thought this might help you start sorting," she said brightly. The box had the words master bedroom written across the side in black marker. I looked at it for several seconds before raising my eyes to hers. "You already labeled boxes?" Her smile tightened slightly. Organization makes stressful situations easier. There it was again. That calm, polished tone she used whenever disguising cruelty as efficiency. She stepped farther into the room and glanced around casually. "Jason thinks we should repaint before listing photos. Probably lighter colors. Buyers like neutral spaces. Buyers. Not memories. Not family. Buyers." I stood slowly from Harold's desk chair. "Did you love my husband?" The question clearly startled her. "What? Harold, did you love him?" Brittany blinked quickly. "Of course I did." I studied her face carefully. Beautiful makeup. Perfect hair. Expensive sweater. Not a single sign of mourning anywhere on her. "Then how are you redecorating his house before the funeral flowers have even died?" For the first time since this nightmare began, Brittany's mask slipped slightly. Annoyance flashed across her face. "Because sitting around drowning in grief does not solve anything." I said nothing. She shifted the box higher against her hip. "Jason is trying very hard to build a future for our family," she continued. "You could make this easier if you wanted to." Easier. That word again. Funny how often selfish people use it while asking others to surrender everything. I walked slowly toward her until we stood only a few feet apart. Then I looked directly into her eyes and said quietly, "My husband spent 42 years building this life with me. You have been here 6. Brittany's expression hardened immediately. Things change. I almost smiled then because suddenly I realized something important. She truly believed she had already won. That night I barely slept. Rain continued tapping softly against the bedroom windows while the old grandfather clock downstairs marked each passing hour with slow hollow chimes. Beside me, Harold's side of the bed remained perfectly untouched. I kept reaching toward the empty space out of habit before remembering all over again that he was gone. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up trying to sleep and walked downstairs in my robe. The house felt colder than usual. Not physically. Emotionally. Like warmth itself had begun leaving room by room. A small lamp glowed in the kitchen. Brittany had left several paint samples spread across the island countertop beside a notebook labeled renovation ideas. I stood there quietly reading the pages. Remove wallpaper. Open floor concept. Replace old cabinetry. Master suite redesign. The words felt strangely cruel. Not because homes cannot change over time, but because they were discussing erasing Harold before his presence had even faded from the air. I turned another page and stopped breathing for a second. Senior housing budget comparison. Underneath were handwritten notes in Brittany's careful script. Silver Pines Assisted Living. Willow Creek Retirement Village. Transportation included. Small units easier to manage. My hands went cold holding the notebook. They had already toured places, compared prices, planned my future without me. Slowly, I closed the notebook and placed it exactly where I found it. Then I made myself a cup of coffee using Harold's old coffee maker, because the familiar sound comforted me somehow. He always woke before sunrise. Every morning for 42 years. Even during retirement, he could never sleep late. He would shuffle downstairs in plaid pajama pants, grind fresh coffee beans too loudly, then stand by the kitchen window watching birds gather near the feeder outside. "Cardinals again," he would say proudly, like he personally invited them over. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and looked out into the dark backyard where rainwater shimmered across the patio stones. Everything still looked the same outside. The maple tree Jason planted as a child swayed gently in the wind. Harold's rose bushes lined the fence exactly as he left them. But inside the house, everything had shifted. Around 7:30 the next morning, Brittany walked into the kitchen wearing workout clothes and carrying her phone. She stopped briefly when she saw me already awake. "You are up early," she said. "So are you." She opened the refrigerator and pulled out yogurt without looking at me. "I have a prenatal yoga class at 9. The normalness of that sentence nearly stunned me. My husband had been buried less than 24 hours earlier, yet Brittany's life continued untouched, organized, scheduled, moving forward exactly as planned. Meanwhile, I still expected Harold to walk through the back door carrying birdseed and humming old Frank Sinatra songs under his breath. Brittany sat at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone while eating yogurt slowly. Finally, she glanced up. Jason wants us all to have dinner tonight. Why? To discuss next steps. There it was again. That businesslike tone. As if my marriage, my grief, and my home were all projects waiting to be managed efficiently. What kind of next steps? I asked quietly. Brittany hesitated briefly before answering. Living arrangements. Finances. Timelines. Timelines. I stared into my coffee cup for a moment. Your husband died 3 years ago, correct? She blinked at the sudden question. Yes. How long did it take before you packed up his belongings? Her expression hardened immediately. That is not the same thing. Why? Because Trevor and I rented an apartment. I nodded slowly. So there was nothing valuable to inherit. Silence settled heavily between us. Brittany's jaw tightened visibly. You think this is about money? She asked coldly. I looked directly at her. I think grief reveals people. She pushed her yogurt aside with obvious irritation. You are being unfair. Before I could answer, Jason entered the kitchen already dressed for work even though he had taken bereavement leave all week. His tie looked crooked and dark circles sat beneath his eyes. He paused awkwardly, sensing the tension immediately. Morning, he muttered. I nodded quietly. Brittany stood and kissed his cheek before grabbing her car keys. Do not forget dinner tonight, she said pointedly. Then she left without another word. The front door closed sharply behind her. Jason rubbed both hands over his face once she was gone. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he sat across from me at the kitchen table, exactly where he used to do homework as a boy while Harold grilled hamburgers outside during summer evenings. Mom, he began carefully, Brittany means well. I almost smiled at that. People always defend cruelty by complimenting intentions. Did you know she researched assisted living facilities before your father died? Jason froze instantly. The silence answered me before he even opened his mouth. You knew, I said softly. He looked exhausted suddenly. We were just exploring options. Without asking me. Because Dad was sick and everything was uncertain. I stared at him carefully. No. Because you assumed the house would become yours. His expression shifted immediately. Guilt. Anger. Shame. Maybe all three at once. That is not fair, he snapped quietly. Your father and I sacrificed everything for this family, I said calmly. We missed vacations to pay for your college tuition. Harold worked overtime for years so you could graduate debt-free. We refinanced this house once to help you start your business after the recession. Do not talk to me about fairness. Jason looked away quickly. Outside, rain continued falling steadily against the kitchen windows. I never asked for any of that, he muttered. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they sounded rehearsed. Like something Brittany had helped him believe over time. I studied my son carefully. Somewhere beneath the tired businessman sitting across from me still lived the little boy who used to run into my arms after school every afternoon. I could still see traces of him sometimes when he laughed unexpectedly or smiled at old family photographs. But those moments had become rare now. Your father was afraid, I said quietly. Jason looked up sharply. What do you mean? I held his gaze steadily. Near the end, he realized things were changing between us. Jason's face lost color immediately. Mom. He noticed the questions about the deed, the realtor conversations, the pressure about downsizing. Jason stood abruptly from the table. You are twisting things. Am I? He paced toward the sink and back again, restless and agitated. Dad knew we needed more room. He knew Brittany was pregnant. He understood practical realities. Practical realities, I repeated softly. That phrase again. Jason turned toward me with visible frustration. What do you want from me? The question lingered painfully between us because suddenly I realized I no longer knew the answer. I wanted my husband back. I wanted the version of my son who once cried when birds flew into windows. I wanted to wake up inside the ordinary life I used to have before grief and greed hollowed out my home. But none of those things were possible anymore. I wanted compassion, I said finally. Jason's shoulders sagged instantly. For a brief moment, genuine guilt crossed his face. "Mom," he whispered. Then his phone buzzed loudly on the counter. He glanced down at the screen automatically. "Brittany." Of course. I watched the exact second his expression changed again. The softness disappeared. The hesitation vanished. "We will talk tonight," he said quickly before grabbing his keys. "Do not make any decisions until then." Decisions. As if I were already negotiating my own removal. I remained seated at the kitchen table long after he left. The house grew silent again except for the steady rain outside and the faint ticking of Harold's old wall clock above the stove. Slowly, I reached into my robe pocket and touched the folded legal papers hidden there. Then for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to think something dangerous. Maybe Harold had not left me helpless after all. That evening, Brittany set the dining room table with expensive white plates she had bought the previous Christmas after announcing my old dishes looked dated. The irony almost made me smile. Harold loved those old dishes because we picked them out together at a flea market during our second year of marriage, when we barely had enough money for groceries. Back then, we thought owning matching plates meant we had officially become adults. Now those same dishes sat packed away somewhere while Brittany arranged crystal wine glasses beneath the chandelier like she was hosting a business meeting instead of discussing where to send her husband's grieving mother. I wore a dark blue sweater Harold always liked because he said it made my eyes look brighter. The sweater still carried a faint trace of his cologne from the last time he hugged me in the hospital parking lot before nurses wheeled him inside for treatment. Sometimes grief hides inside ordinary things like fabric and scent and empty coffee cups. Jason arrived home carrying takeout bags from an Italian restaurant downtown. Apparently nobody planned on cooking anymore. "I figured we could keep things simple tonight," he said while setting containers on the kitchen counter. Simple. Another carefully chosen word. Brittany lit candles before sitting down at the table. The soft golden light flickered across her polished makeup and perfectly curled blonde hair. She looked composed. Prepared. Like someone walking into a negotiation she already expected to win. I folded my napkin carefully across my lap while Jason poured wine into glasses none of us really wanted. For several minutes we ate in strained silence. Forks scraped against plates. Ice clinked softly in water glasses. Outside, rain still drifted across the dark windows in slow silver streaks. Finally Brittany set down her fork and looked directly at me. "We have been thinking a lot about what is best moving forward," she began gently. There it was. The voice. Calm. Controlled. Professional. Like a human resources manager firing an employee before Christmas. I took a small sip of water. "Have you?" Jason cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mom, we know this is hard. Do you?" He looked down immediately. Brittany leaned slightly forward. "Nobody is trying to hurt you, Eleanor." Strange how people say that right before doing exactly that. "The truth is," she continued carefully, "this house makes the most sense for Jason and me long term. Especially with the baby coming." Baby. She always emphasized that word now like it granted moral superiority to everything else she wanted. "You could be very happy somewhere smaller," she added. "Somewhere without all this maintenance." I looked around the dining room slowly. Harold rebuilt most of this room himself after a pipe burst during the winter of 2006. We spent 3 straight weekends repainting walls while listening to old jazz records and eating frozen pizza on the floor, because all the furniture was pushed into the garage. Maintenance. That was all 42 years had become. Jason finally spoke again. "We found a place called Willow Creek about 20 minutes from here." I kept my expression calm even though my heartbeat quickened slightly. "You already visited it." Neither of them answered immediately. That silence told me enough. Brittany folded her hands together neatly. "It has a beautiful courtyard and transportation services. They even offer art classes." Art classes. As if watercolor lessons could replace losing your husband, your home, and your dignity in the same week. "And how long have you been planning this?" I asked quietly. Jason exhaled sharply. "Mom, please stop acting like this is some conspiracy. Is it not? Brittany's smile faded slightly around the edges. We are trying to help you transition into the next stage of life. Transition. Another polished word hiding something ugly underneath. I suddenly remembered a conversation from nearly 2 years earlier during a family barbecue. Harold was grilling steaks outside while Brittany stood in the kitchen describing how her grandmother moved into a retirement community after becoming widowed. Honestly, older people are happier when they simplify, she said back then while arranging potato salad into serving bowls. Too many memories just keep people stuck. Harold looked at me immediately after she said it. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. Some instincts arrive quietly, like distant thunder before storms. Jason pushed his food around the plate without eating much. Mom, the truth is this house is worth almost $900,000 now. There it was at last. Not grief. Not concern. Numbers. Property values. Equity. Brittany glanced toward him quickly but said nothing. I looked at my son carefully. Your father is not even buried a full week, and you are already calculating profit. That is not fair, he snapped. I am trying to think about the future. Whose future? Silence again. Brittany reached across the table and touched Jason's arm gently. The gesture looked rehearsed somehow. Supportive in the way actors look supportive during commercials. Nobody is taking anything from you, she said softly. I almost laughed at that. Half my closet had already disappeared. Realtors walked through my living room while funeral flowers still sat fresh on the mantel. They had packed boxes before I even returned from the cemetery. You already took the comfort of grieving in peace, I replied quietly. Jason rubbed both hands across his face. What do you want us to do? Wait years. Years. I stared at him in disbelief. Your father died 6 days ago. Brittany's expression hardened slightly then softened again almost instantly. Dragging this out emotionally is unhealthy for everyone, she said. Especially for the baby. There it was again. Every selfish decision wrapped carefully in concern for the unborn child. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate. Do you know what Harold said the week before he died? Jason looked up sharply. What? He asked me to promise I would not let anyone pressure me after he was gone. Neither of them moved. Even the air in the room felt heavier suddenly. Brittany recovered first. Eleanor, nobody is pressuring you. I reached into my sweater pocket and touched the folded copy of the trust documents hidden there. The paper felt steady beneath my fingertips. Solid. Real. Harold knew exactly what was coming. Then why did you remove my belongings while I attended his funeral? Jason's face lost color immediately. Brittany opened her mouth, then closed it again. Finally Jason spoke softly. We thought it would be easier. Easier. Always easier. Never kinder. Just easier. I stood slowly from the table and carried my untouched plate toward the sink. Behind me I could feel both of them watching carefully, measuring my reaction, waiting for weakness. I am tired, I said quietly. Brittany stood too quickly. Before you go upstairs, there is something else. I turned slowly. She slid a folder across the table toward me. Printed brochures spilled partially from inside. Willow Creek Senior Living. Silver Pines Retirement Community. Meadowbrook Assisted Care. My chest tightened painfully for one brief second before something colder replaced the hurt. Clarity. They really believed I was already defeated. Brittany smiled gently like a nurse delivering medication. We highlighted the units we thought would fit your budget best. I looked at the highlighted brochures, then at my son. He could not even meet my eyes anymore. Your father once told me greed changes people slowly, I said quietly. So slowly they stop recognizing themselves. Jason whispered my name softly, but I continued anyway. I think he was right. Then I walked upstairs carrying Harold's memory and the hidden legal papers while downstairs my son and his wife sat surrounded by brochures for places they thought would become my future. Neither of them realized that Harold had already prepared a very different future for all of us. The next morning, sunlight finally broke through the rain clouds for the first time all week. Thin golden light spilled across the kitchen floor while I stood quietly making coffee beside the same window where Harold used to watch cardinals gather every morning. The feeder outside sat nearly empty now. Harold always remembered to refill it before sunrise. I stared at the little red bird perched alone on the fence and felt grief settle heavily in my chest again. Funny how loss arrives in waves. One moment you feel almost steady. The next, a bird outside your kitchen window reminds you your entire life has changed. Upstairs, I could hear footsteps moving back and forth through the hallway. Drawers opening. Closet doors sliding. Brittany had spent the last 2 days reorganizing rooms as if the house already belonged to her. Yesterday she moved framed family photographs from the living room into storage boxes because she claimed the walls looked too cluttered. Harold's favorite armchair had disappeared from the den entirely. I found it shoved into the garage beside paint cans and folded moving blankets. The sight of it sitting there nearly broke something inside me. Harold spent countless evenings in that chair reading newspapers and watching old Western movies with the volume too loud because his hearing worsened after chemotherapy. Every Christmas morning, Jason used to sit on the floor beside that chair opening presents while Harold pretended not to notice wrapping paper piling everywhere. And now it sat abandoned beside gardening tools like unwanted junk. I carried my coffee upstairs slowly. Halfway down the hallway, I stopped when I heard Brittany speaking on the phone inside the guest room. "No, the property should be available soon," she said quietly. The timing actually worked out better than we expected. I stood completely still. Silence followed for a second before she laughed softly. "Trust me, Jason's mother will not fight this." Something cold moved through me then. Not anger exactly. Clarity. I walked quietly back downstairs before she noticed me listening. For the first time in my life, I truly understood how dangerous underestimating someone could become. Brittany believed kindness meant weakness because she had never learned the difference between the two. Around noon, Jason left for a meeting with his financial advisor, while Brittany headed out to meet a contractor about kitchen renovations. Renovations. The word barely shocked me anymore. The second their cars disappeared down the street, I returned upstairs and locked the bedroom door behind me. Then I took Harold's documents from beneath my sweaters inside the dresser drawer where I had hidden them carefully. My hands no longer trembled opening the papers. Fear had started transforming into something steadier now. Purpose. I reread every page slowly. Property transfer documents. Trust agreements. Legal instructions. Harold organized everything meticulously. Near the back of the binder sat a business card for Donovan Pierce with a handwritten note beneath it. "Things become difficult, call him immediately." I stared at the card for a long moment before finally reaching for my phone. Donovan answered after the second ring. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Gravelly. Calm. "Donovan Pierce speaking. This is Eleanor Whitmore." Silence filled the line briefly. Then his tone softened immediately. "Eleanor. I am so sorry about Harold." My throat tightened hearing my husband's name spoken kindly for the first time in days. "Thank you. How are you holding up?" I looked around the bedroom slowly. Half-empty closet. Packed boxes. Missing photographs. "Honestly," I said quietly, "not as well as Harold expected." Another brief silence followed. Then Donovan exhaled slowly. "So they started already." Not a question. A statement. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "You knew." "Harold prepared me months ago." My chest tightened painfully. Even now, my husband was still one step ahead of everyone. Donovan's voice remained calm and measured. "Did you read the trust documents?" "Yes." "Good. Then listen carefully. Do not sign anything. Do not verbally agree to any property transfers. And most importantly, do not tell Jason or Brittany what you know." I stared toward the bedroom window where sunlight drifted softly across Harold's side of the bed. Harold really believed it would come to this. Donovan hesitated before answering. Toward the end, Harold became very concerned, especially after Brittany contacted a private realtor without informing him. My stomach tightened again. How long ago? About 4 months. For months. Harold had been sitting through chemotherapy treatments while his son and daughter-in-law quietly prepared to take his house. I closed my eyes briefly. Donovan continued carefully. "There is something else you should know." Harold discovered Jason attempted to discuss early transfer options with the bank last spring. My breath caught. "Jason did what?" "Nothing illegal occurred," Donovan said quickly. "But Harold realized your son assumed ownership arrangements would change after his death." I pressed my fingers against my forehead. Somewhere downstairs, The refrigerator hummed softly in the empty kitchen. The ordinary sound felt strangely distant now. "What am I supposed to do?" I whispered. Donovan's answer came immediately. "Exactly what Harold asked you to do. Stay calm." Calm. Harold always admired calm people. During storms. During illness. During financial struggles early in our marriage. Panic clouds judgment. He used to say whenever life became difficult. Donovan lowered his voice slightly. "Eleanor, the trust is airtight. The house legally belongs to you. If anyone attempts coercion or forced displacement, there are consequences." I looked again toward the hallway where Brittany's packed moving boxes sat lined neatly against the wall waiting for me to disappear. They already think they won. Then let them keep thinking that for now. After we hung up, I remained sitting quietly on the bed for a long time. My grief still lived there inside me. Deep, heavy, permanent. But now it stood beside something else. Awareness. Harold had not left me defenseless. He had simply understood something I refused to see until now. Love without boundaries invites exploitation. Around 3 that afternoon, Brittany returned home carrying shopping bags and paint samples while humming softly to herself. She looked almost cheerful. "Good news," she announced while setting everything across the kitchen island. "The contractor says opening the kitchen wall would completely modernize the downstairs." I looked at her calmly while folding laundry at the dining room table. "That wall was built by Harold himself." She paused briefly. "Well, trends change." Then she spread glossy renovation brochures across the counter. White marble countertops. Open shelving. Stainless steel appliances. She had already circled design ideas in red ink. "This house has incredible potential once it is updated properly," she said. Properly. As if 42 years of memories were simply outdated decor waiting to be corrected. I folded another towel carefully before speaking. "You seem very certain you will be staying here." Brittany smiled faintly without looking up from the brochures. "Jason and I are building a future." I studied her face quietly. Confident. Relaxed. Completely convinced the outcome was already decided. For the first time since Harold died, I almost felt sorry for her. Not because she was cruel, but because she had mistaken silence for surrender. And soon that mistake was going to change everything. 3 days later, Brittany hosted a brunch in my dining room for 2 women from her church group while I sat quietly in the sunroom pretending to read a magazine. Through the partially open doorway, I could hear every word. "The neighborhood is perfect for families," Brittany said brightly. "And once we renovate the downstairs, the value will probably jump another 200,000. One of the women laughed softly. "You must be excited finally having your own place." My fingers tightened slightly around the magazine page. Your own place. Not Eleanor's home. Not the house Harold built room by room over 42 years. Already rewritten. Already reassigned. Brittany lowered her voice slightly, though not enough. "We have just been waiting for the right timing." Timing. Such a clean word for betrayal. I remained perfectly still in the sunroom while sunlight warmed the carpet beneath my feet. Outside, Harold's rose bushes swayed gently in the late spring breeze. He planted those roses during our 25th wedding anniversary, because I once mentioned missing the gardens from my childhood home in Indiana. Every year afterward, he trimmed them himself no matter how tired he felt. Even during chemotherapy, he insisted on watering them every evening because flowers still deserve attention. I stared at those roses while listening to another woman compliment Brittany on handling the transition so gracefully. Transition again. The entire world suddenly seemed full of people using beautiful words to disguise ugly things. Later that afternoon, after Brittany's guests left, I walked into the kitchen and found her rearranging cabinets. She had already boxed half my dishes without asking. "I moved the older plates into storage," she said casually. "The kitchen feels cleaner now. Cleaner. Lighter. Simpler." Every word carried the same message underneath. Remove the past. Remove Harold. Remove me. I opened one of the cabinets slowly. Empty shelves stared back at me where family dishes once sat stacked carefully for holidays and birthdays and Sunday dinners. "You move quickly," I said quietly. Brittany smiled without looking up from the counter. "I like staying productive." Productive. Another word people use when avoiding guilt. My phone rang before I could answer. Donovan Pierce. I stepped quietly into the hallway before answering. Eleanor, he said immediately. I need you downtown tomorrow morning. My pulse quickened slightly. Why? Because Jason contacted Fairview Realty again. I closed my eyes briefly. He is moving forward anyway. Yes, Donovan replied calmly. And he made another mistake. I leaned against the hallway wall while Brittany hummed softly in the kitchen nearby. What kind of mistake? Donovan lowered his voice slightly. He attempted to discuss listing timelines before probate procedures concluded. The realtor became uncomfortable once legal ownership details surfaced. For several seconds I said nothing. Somewhere inside me, grief and disbelief tangled together painfully. My son was trying to sell a house that legally was not his while I still slept inside it. Donovan continued carefully. I want you here tomorrow before they arrive. Jason scheduled a meeting at my office. I almost laughed at the irony. Jason believed he was walking into a negotiation. He had no idea Harold already finished the conversation months ago. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a cream blouse Harold always liked because he said it made me look elegant. Funny how grief changes simple routines. Even choosing clothing became emotional now because everything carried memories attached to it. Downstairs, Jason stood near the front door adjusting his tie while Brittany scrolled through her phone beside him. Ready? She asked casually when she saw me. I nodded once. The drive downtown passed mostly in silence. Brittany spent half the trip discussing kitchen contractors while Jason stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel too tightly. I watched familiar streets slide past the car windows and remembered all the years Harold drove these same roads beside me. Saturday breakfasts, Christmas shopping, doctor appointments near the end. Ordinary life suddenly seemed sacred once it disappeared. Donovan's law office occupied the third floor of an old brick building overlooking the Fox River. Harold always liked this building because it reminded him of Chicago architecture from the 1970s. Solid construction, he used to say approvingly whenever we visited. Donovan greeted us personally in the lobby. His silver hair looked slightly thinner than I remembered, but his expression remained calm and unreadable. Thank you for coming, he said politely. Brittany immediately slipped into her polished social smile. Of course. We appreciate you helping everyone move forward. Move forward. There was that phrase again. Donovan simply nodded and led us into a large conference room overlooking the river. Sunlight reflected softly across the polished oak table, while folders rested neatly beside four leather chairs. Jason sat first. Brittany beside him. I remained silent while Donovan took the chair across from us. For a few moments nobody spoke. Then Brittany folded her hands together professionally. We were hoping to discuss timelines regarding the property. Donovan looked directly at her. What property? Her smile flickered slightly. The Whitmore residence. Donovan opened a folder carefully. Interesting. Jason shifted uncomfortably. What does that mean? Donovan removed several documents and placed them neatly on the table. It means your father anticipated this conversation. Silence filled the room instantly. I watched Jason's face carefully. Confusion first, then concern. Brittany leaned slightly forward. I am not sure what that means. Donovan adjusted his glasses calmly. 2 months before his passing, Harold Whitmore transferred the residence into an irrevocable trust. Brittany blinked quickly. Transferred to who? Donovan looked directly at me. To Eleanor Whitmore. Jason stared at him like he had misheard. What? Donovan slid copies of the trust documents across the table slowly. Your father remained mentally competent throughout the process. Everything was witnessed, notarized, and legally executed. Brittany grabbed the papers immediately. Her eyes moved rapidly across the pages while color slowly drained from her face. Jason looked completely stunned. That is not possible, he whispered. Donovan remained calm. It is very possible. In fact, it is already finalized. I sat quietly while Brittany reread the same page 3 times. Her polished composure finally began cracking around the edges. There has to be some mistake, she said sharply. Harold told us this house would stay in the family. Donovan folded his hands together. It is staying in the family. Mrs. Whitmore is family. Brittany opened her mouth, then closed it again. Jason finally turned toward me. Mom, you knew. I met his eyes steadily for the first time in days. Your father made sure I would be protected. The silence afterward felt enormous. Heavy. Final. Donovan calmly opened another folder. There is one additional clause you should both understand. Brittany looked visibly pale now. Donovan continued carefully. Any attempt involving coercion, forced relocation, manipulation of property rights, or pressure placed upon Eleanor Whitmore regarding residence displacement immediately voids inheritance privileges connected to Harold Whitmore's remaining estate. Jason's face lost all color. What does that mean? Donovan's answer came quietly. It means your father anticipated pressure might be placed upon your mother after his death. He included legal consequences. Brittany suddenly pushed back her chair. This is ridiculous. Donovan remained perfectly calm. Actually, it is extremely thorough. Jason looked at me again then. Really looked at me for the first time since the funeral. Not as an obstacle. Not as a grieving old woman. But as someone no longer powerless. And in that moment I think my son finally realized the person who truly understood this family best had never been Brittany. It had been Harold. The drive home from Donovan's office passed in complete silence. Jason stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles looked pale against the leather. Brittany sat rigidly beside him with Harold's trust documents resting unopened in her lap like something poisonous. I watched familiar streets move past the windows while late afternoon sunlight stretched across the sidewalks in long golden shadows. A week earlier, I would have given anything to avoid conflict with my son. Now I sat quietly beside two people who had already planned my removal from the only home I had left. Strange how quickly grief changes the shape of love. When we pulled into the driveway, nobody moved right away. The house stood exactly as it always had. White shutters. Brick walkway. Harold's maple tree swaying gently in the warm breeze near the front yard. Everything looked peaceful from the outside. But inside that house, something irreversible had finally broken apart. Jason shut off the engine slowly. Mom, he began quietly. I opened the car door before he could finish. I am tired, Jason. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Brittany climbed out immediately and walked toward the front door without saying a word. Her heels clicked sharply against the concrete driveway. For the first time since Harold died, she no longer looked confident. She looked angry. The difference mattered. Inside the house, she dropped her purse onto the kitchen counter and spun toward Jason. You told me the house would eventually be yours, she snapped. Jason looked exhausted. That is what Dad implied for years. Apparently your father changed his mind. Her voice carried a bitterness sharp enough to cut glass. I quietly removed my sweater and folded it over the back of a chair while they argued across the kitchen. Funny how quickly politeness disappears once money leaves the conversation. He blindsided us, Brittany continued. No, I said softly. They both turned toward me immediately. Harold protected me. Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Brittany crossed her arms tightly. From what exactly? I looked at her calmly. From being treated like a problem that needed relocation. Jason closed his eyes briefly like the words physically hurt him. Good. Perhaps they should. For days, I had walked through my own grief while listening to discussions about timelines and renovation budgets and retirement communities. Someone needed to finally sit with discomfort besides me. Brittany grabbed the trust documents from the counter. This clause is ridiculous, she said sharply while flipping through pages. Coercion? Displacement? Harold acted like we were criminals. Did you or did you not contact assisted living facilities before discussing it with me? She froze briefly. That was planning ahead. Did you or did you not remove my belongings during Harold's funeral? Jason stepped forward immediately. Mom, enough. I turned toward him slowly. Enough. My voice remained quiet, but something inside it finally shifted. Your father had not even been buried 24 hours before you invited a realtor into our home. Jason looked away instantly. The kitchen fell silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of Harold's wall clock above the stove. I suddenly realized how exhausted I felt. Not physically, spiritually, like I had spent days defending my right to exist inside my own life. I walked slowly toward the staircase. I think it is best everyone gets some rest tonight. Brittany laughed once under her breath. Sharp. Bitter. Easy for you to say. I paused at the bottom stair and looked back at her carefully. No, Brittany. Easy would have been kindness. Then I went upstairs. That night I sat alone on the back porch wrapped in one of Harold's old blankets while crickets hummed softly across the yard. Summer air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and roses drifting through the darkness. Harold loved summer nights. He used to sit beside me out here with iced tea balanced on the porch railing while we talked about ordinary things. Bird feeders. Grocery prices. Neighborhood gossip. The kind of small conversations people never realize they will someday miss more than anything. I looked toward the garage where Harold's workshop light still hung above the side door. He built so much of our life with those hands. Shelves. Cabinets. Birdhouses for grandchildren we never ended up having. During the final year of his illness, he still insisted on fixing things around the house because taking care of home means taking care of family. I understood now why those words mattered so much to him near the end. Around midnight, I heard the back door open quietly behind me. Jason stepped onto the porch holding 2 mugs of tea. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he handed one mug toward me. Chamomile, he said softly, like Dad used to make. I accepted the mug carefully. Steam curled upward into the cool night air between us. Jason leaned against the porch railing staring out at the dark yard. He looked older suddenly. Not physically. Emotionally. Like the weight of recent days had finally settled onto his shoulders all at once. I did not know, he said quietly after a long silence. About what? About the trust. About Dad thinking. His voice faded. I watched him carefully. Thinking you would pressure me? Jason swallowed hard. I never wanted to hurt you. The sad thing was I believed him. Not completely. Not purely. But enough. Jason was not cruel the way Brittany could be. Jason was weak. And weakness often becomes dangerous when mixed with greed and fear, and someone else whispering in your ear long enough. Your father worried you were changing, I said softly. Jason stared down into his untouched tea. Maybe I did. We sat quietly after that while wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once before silence returned again. Finally Jason spoke. Brittany thought we were building something stable. At my expense. He winced slightly at the words. I know how this looks. No, I said quietly. I think you are only beginning to. Jason rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. What happens now? I looked out toward Harold's rose bushes glowing pale beneath the moonlight. That depends on what kind of people you choose to become after this. He stared at me for a long moment then. Really stared. And for the first time since the funeral I saw shame there. Real shame. Not embarrassment over money. Not frustration over legal documents. Shame over himself. Sometimes grief strips away illusions faster than time ever could. 2 mornings later, Brittany packed 3 large suitcases before breakfast. The house remained silent while she moved through rooms gathering clothes and cosmetics with clipped, irritated movements. Jason followed her quietly carrying boxes down the front steps toward the car. Neither of them argued anymore. Some fights end not with explosions but with realization. I stood in the kitchen watering Harold's small herb garden near the window while they loaded the trunk outside. Basil. Rosemary. Mint. Harold loved fresh herbs because he said food should taste alive. Eventually Jason came back inside alone. He looked exhausted. Brittany is staying with her sister for a while, he said quietly. I nodded once. He lingered awkwardly near the doorway. She thinks you manipulated Dad against us. I almost smiled sadly at that. Your father was many things, Jason. Easy to manipulate was never one of them. He looked down immediately. I do not know how we got here. I studied my son carefully. The same eyes Harold had. The same crooked nose from childhood baseball accidents. So much of my husband still existed inside him despite everything. Choices, I said softly. We got here one choice at a time. Jason nodded slowly without arguing. Then he picked up the final suitcase and walked outside. I stood by the kitchen window watching him load the car beside Brittany. Neither looked back toward the house before driving away. Silence settled over the rooms once the engine disappeared down the street. Deep silence. Honest silence. I walked slowly through the house afterward, touching familiar things as I passed. Harold's armchair back in its proper corner. Family photographs returned to the mantel. The old dishes safely back inside kitchen cabinets where they belonged. Upstairs, sunlight streamed gently across our bedroom floor, while warm summer air drifted through open windows carrying the scent of roses from outside. I sat quietly on the edge of the bed and looked around the room Harold and I built together over 42 years. The grief was still there. It always would be. But beneath it now lived something steadier. Peace. Harold buried more than legal documents before he died. He buried protection inside every choice he made for me near the end. And in the end, the people who tried to push me out of my own home walked away from it themselves.